Hello, this is Gilbert Gottfried, and this is Gilbert Gottfried's amazing Colossal podcast with my co-host Frank Santopadre and our engineer Frank Verderosa. Our guest this week is a former stand-up comedian, an occasional actor, a producer, a documentarian, a mockumentarian, an Emmy-winning writer and director of some of the most successful and audacious comedy features in the history of the medium. He's written for popular TV shows like Entourage, Fridays, Mad About You, Dilbert, The Tick, and of course Seinfeld. Writing or co-writing some of the show's most memorable and most bizarre episodes, including The Opera, The Brisk, The Bubble Boy, The Outing, and also helped coin the phrase, "Not that there's anything wrong with that." As a director, he's helmed classic episodes of his friend Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm, as well as the feature films Masked and Anonymous, Army of One, Bruno, Religulous, The Dictator, and one of the most original and most profitable movies of all time, Borat. His newest project, coming to Netflix on February 15th, is Larry Charles' Dangerous World of Comedy, in which he travels to some of the world's most perilous destinations in search of humor. Frank and I saw the first episode and our jaws are still on the floor. Well, I saw the whole thing. Frank only saw the first
Braggart.
one. Yeah, he's not a professional. Please welcome to the podcast one of the great comic minds of his generation, a man who shares our love of classic comedy teams, and a man who once had the life-altering experience when Jack Nicholson smiled at him from a passing car. The brilliantly talented Larry Charles.
Oh my God, thank you so much. I'm humbled by that introduction, and I'm actually exhausted by it as well.
That's our goal, Larry.
Thank you.
To wear the guest out early.
And you could use it for your obituary, too, when needed.
It's perfect.
Yes.
It's perfect.
Now, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, I'm not a sports fan, and I never watched the Super Bowl, but now there's some Jewish hero football player.
Julian Edelman.
Julian Edelman, of course. I mean, I think this, remember, I don't know if you remember when we were kids, there was a player on the Mets named Al Weiss.
Sure, second baseman.
All the Jewish kids in Brooklyn wanted to, take credit for him as a Jew in baseball. But of course, he was German and just had a name that was kind of sounded Jewish. I don't even believe, if you ever watch Edelman, he looks like a white supremacist. He acts like a white supremacist. His girlfriend is a white supremacist. I don't know. I know he identifies as a Jew, but I'm skeptical. That's all.
So we should proceed with caution.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Starting the show with an Al Weiss reference.
Don't let him into the Minion without really checking his penis. That's all I'm saying.
And then there's those other celebrities who have been called Jews but never were. Like, Joe Namath, a lot of people thought was a Jew. Michael Caine, not a Jew.
Who thought Michael Caine was a Jew?
A couple of people.
Because his name is Morris.
Morris, yes.
Morris, there you are. I have two Uncle Morrises. I would believe that.
And people thought Ringo was a Jew.
This is all about the nose, isn't it, Gilbert?
Yeah.
I mean, all these guys you mentioned have very prominent proboscis.
So So I was watching The Dangerous World of Comedy. Frank watched like 5 minutes.
No, I watched the whole first one. I was busy doing the research you won't do.
He was waiting for a commercial. It never came.
Yeah. So now, and this deals with one of those subjects that I always like to talk about, like the connection between, tragedy and horror with comedy and how the two just go together.
Well, I part of my thing always in my life in terms of comedy has been to look for things that really aren't funny. And then move
you
it like
found
10
it on this
degrees,
show.
and suddenly it becomes comedy. And I thought to myself at this point in my life, what could I do that kind of is my honest, authentic version of that now? That's not fictional. It's not artificial. It's not contrived. What could I do? What can I do? And I thought, I've been to a lot of these crazy foreign countries, sometimes in the midst of great turmoil. And I always meet comedians in all these places, Uruguay and all your strange Argentina, strange countries, Romania, Morocco. There's always comedians. In fact, Morocco has a stand-up comedy festival. So I thought, wow, these people, I get to go home and I get all these accolades, but these people have to stay in sometimes very oppressive regimes. And how do they do their comedy? How do they survive? And that was my initial kind of challenge to myself to figure that out.
Well, it always gets me when I'll hear people say like, oh, it's really tough now, because Trump has a dictatorship. And
Right.
when you go to a real dictatorship.
Yes.
He's doing his best, Gilbert.
Yeah.
Give him a chance.
Well, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the stakes are very different in American comedy than they are in a lot of other countries, especially these war-torn countries. I mean, I was in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. I was in Liberia, as you mentioned, and Somalia, which is one of the most dangerous places on earth. A place that I probably should not have gone to, quite frankly, was that dangerous and that absurd to be there for me. But there are comedians there, and there are comedians who have been assassinated there. And most comedians in Somalia who insist, and it's kind of like their mission, their calling to continue doing their comedy, they live with that risk of being gunned down by some assassins. And many of them have had the experience of being kidnapped or tortured, and they go back and they do their comedy. And that to me is very courageous. And I was bowled over by that kind of, it felt like the opposite of what American comedians would do under those conditions,
Wasn't there one in Iraq, too? Was it Hassan, the one that was assassinated in 2006?
Yes, there was a very famous comedian assassinated in Iraq also. And if you start to look deeply, I mean, look at Saudi Arabia right now.
Yeah.
It's there's a comedian in Saudi Arabia who I interviewed who's not in the show, actually, who's known as the Seinfeld of Saudi Arabia, and he has currently been arrested and detained and is in prison and kind of out of contact with people. So life changes very quickly there. So yes, here we have Trump, we have some oppression, we have some fear of what the future might hold. But right now, as it stands, you and I can say anything we want right now on this show, and nothing's going to happen to us. And that's one of the advantages of being here.
Yeah, it's like they talk a lot about, Kathy Griffin with the photo holding Trump's head. And you go, look, she's in loads of trouble. And it's like she's still working.
Yes, exactly.
She's got a nice house, whatever.
She's free. Being free is not an assumption that a lot of these comedians can make. They're often just like sort of imprisoned for no reason for periods of time and then let go. It's a very arbitrary existence. Their families are under threat at all times. It's a very different life. However, as you discovered, I hope, in the show, their needs, their wants, their desires are exactly the same as Americans. They want safety, they want security, they want a job, they want food on the table, they want their kids to be safe. They want those basic things, and that connects them very much to our experience.
The courage of these people is what you come away with, too. Like al-Bashir, is that his name? The guy that's sort of the Jon Stewart of Iraq?
Yes.
And what he's gone through. And was
Amazing.
he was imprisoned and joked with his torturers so that they wouldn't kill him? The joke about don't put the bottle up my ass?
Exactly, and it worked. It worked for him. Now he's witnessed. He's been involved. He was involved in a suicide bombing.
Yeah.
His brother was killed. Many members of his family were wiped out or injured very, very badly. He's been imprisoned, as you mentioned, and tortured more than once. And here he is. He's the most important voice in Iraq, really, at this point. He's the only person doing what he's doing.
And there was such a strange part of the movie that looked like it was dreamt up. I thought, this can't be real. There was a general.
Oh, the warlord, the ex-warlord.
Yes, named Butt Naked.
Yes.
And you're thinking, how fierce and how scary this guy is that he can have proudly call himself Butt Naked and nobody laughs at that. He's that scary. He's that dangerous.
Well, did he go into battle naked because he somehow thought it made him invulnerable?
Absolutely. That was the how it got started. The media sort of dubbed him Butt Naked because he would fight naked. He would have all his soldiers fight naked because he believed that the bullets would not penetrate them if they were naked. Yeah. So, and in his case, it worked. He's alive. Not only is he alive, he was a cannibal. He slaughtered children while they were alive. He would take them and sacrifice them and then feed their hearts to the other child soldiers to get them in the mindset to fight the battles. And that's who he was, and he survived it. And even though he killed so many people, they have forgiven him. He's like a preacher now in Liberia, in Monrovia. So, very surreal story. I was very interested in meeting him. It was the first night we got to Liberia. It was very scary. You're on the street where the war took place, where he did his fighting.
Yeah.
And he's
a
telling me
darkened
the stories.
street.
A very darkened street.
And the funniest part of that I thought, oh, come on, somebody wrote this for him. It can't be real. You asked him what makes him laugh.
Yes.
And tell us the answer.
He said, I love Bill Cosby, and I love his show, Kids Say the Darndest Thing.
Just too great.
After confessing to murdering children, that was his favorite show. And again, even though I'm scared in that situation, and I'm nervous and I'm anxious, I knew when he said that, I was like, yeah, I had a great piece. I had a great piece for the film,
I mean, he's a cannibal and a bloodthirsty killer, but he loves Cosby and Kids.
He loves to laugh.
Yeah. Also, Sanford and Son.
Sanford and Son too. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're a brave man, Larry. I mean, you say it in that episode. What am I doing? At some point, you have a moment of realization. What the hell am I doing on this darkened street in Liberia, talking to this guy with 20,000 kills?
Yes.
To his credit, and you're asking him provocative questions.
Well, the first question I asked him was, what does human flesh taste like? And he told me, like pork ribs. I mean, he didn't hesitate even to answer the question.
Unbelievable. All I could think of was George Costanza's porn name, Buck Naked.
Buck Naked, yeah, exactly.
That is, and boy, too, the women, the female comedians too in Liberia, what was her name, Super Mama
and Mamie.
The bravery and what they've been through.
Unbelievable.
I mean, if you think it's hard to
do, as children, they are being raped by soldiers. They're having children. They're on the run constantly. They're watching. They're standing there while people are being killed all around them. And they wind up finding some humor, some way of using humor, not so much to criticize, but to heal. And that, again, was kind of an epiphany for me, is like, oh, wow, these people are not coming out of this bitter and angry, really, or wanting to really critique or satirize what's going on. People do that also. Al-Bashir certainly does. But a lot of people, their motivation after experiencing that is to help others heal. And that I found very moving, surprisingly moving, and I wasn't really anticipating that.
Of course.
And I found it really interesting, too. They showed a comedy club in, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, wherever. Mm-hmm. And of course, they're on stage in front of a brick wall.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Was that the LOL club in
No, it wasn't. The LOL Club is closed now, but they also had a brick wall.
Yeah.
But the place you're talking about was in Saudi Arabia, and it had the brick wall. It was all set up like a regular comedy club. Only men are allowed, which is kind of interesting also, and but completely imitating the American Comedy Club. Absolutely, yes. And all of them are, this is the thing, although there's a lot of original cultural humor that comes out of these different societies, the foundation for all modern humor like this everywhere, all modern humor is Western humor. So people are watching videos and seeing you and other great comedians on stage in front of a brick wall, and they want to recreate that experience. That to those people, to those cultures, is what comedy is.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, at one point you were talking about how they didn't really even know what stand-up was. They thought that jokes were very cruel things at somebody else's expense.
They were insults, which, of course, as we know from some of our favorite comedians like Jackie Leonard or Don Rickles, that is kind of like a raison d'etre for their humor as well. But here, people didn't realize that there was a joke involved. They didn't know what a joke was, essentially.
They didn't understand set-up punchline.
No, not at all.
Right, exactly. Those ideas were brought from watching videos of American comedy. American comedy is imperialistic, just like American culture is, and it's spread everywhere, and everyone from Nigeria to Saudi Arabia is basically influenced deeply by American comedy.
Wow. I wonder what they think of you in Saudi Arabia if they're watching clips. I mean, how much American comedy are they seeing? What are they getting?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. But I found, for instance, Seinfeld is massively popular, like in the Arab nations.
Oh my God.
And even in Africa. We would go, when I was in Jordan, when we were shooting Bruno, we would walk down the street in Oman, which is a Muslim country, very highly anti-Semitic Muslim country at times. There's no Jews. Most of these countries I was in, by the way, I'm the only Jew. I'm the only Jew in this country.
Brave man.
Yeah. So when we were shooting Bruno in Jordan, the coterie were the only Jews there, Sasha and a few other people. But you'd walk down the street and there'd be all these street sellers selling bootleg DVDs. And invariably, you'd walk down the street and then you would see Borat, you would see Curb Your Enthusiasm, you would see Seinfeld, and then you would see a copy of Mein Kampf. It was always...
Unbelievable.
Those were the four big bestsellers.
And Norman's Corner, Gilbert.
Yes.
DVD of Norman's Corner.
Right. Yes. Did you write that with Larry David? Was that something you did with Larry David?
Yeah, you bet.
Yes. In fact, my favorite story that I love telling is, he wrote Norman's Corner, and I starred in it. And then when they were pitching Seinfeld to the network, and they said, well, who's creating this show? And they said, Larry David. And one of the high execs at NBC said, isn't he the guy that wrote that piece of shit for Gilbert Gottfried?
That's so great.
Arnold Stang was good in it, though, Gilbert.
Yes, he
Give
was.
credit for casting Arnold Stang. Larry, when did you guys met a couple of times over the years? Gilbert was unsure how many times or where.
I'm going to tell you what I think is the first time we met, and then you tell me if I'm wrong about that. We met in the mid 80s, I would say, like 84, through Richard Belzer.
Yeah.
Richard Belzer had a show on Cinemax, and you were a guest on that show, and I think that's the first time I met you and saw you perform live also.
Wow.
Yeah, I just remember you're one of those people I always kind of ran into.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Well, you're both from the same neighborhood.
Where are you from in Brooklyn?
Okay, I was born in Coney Island.
Okay.
And then Borough Park, and then... No. Born in Coney Island, then Crown Heights, and then Borough Park.
Yeah, so you moved to the other side of Brooklyn after Coney Island pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I stayed in Coney Island, Brighton Beach. I was in Trump Village, which was on the, split the difference between Brighton Beach on the one side and Coney Island on the other. And that's pretty much where I grew up until my parents got divorced, and then my mother moved us to Florida, of course, that's where you have to go. And but that part of Brooklyn, that Coney Island part of Brooklyn, that's where I grew up as well. Yeah, and that's where Larry's from, Brighton Beach as well.
Yeah,
as is Mel Brooks, and
right.
like that is kind of a comedy golden triangle for some bizarre reason.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about your upbringing, because I'm not sure people know too much about this, and I was surprised to find that your father was a stand-up. He did comedy.
My father was a failed stand-up. My father went, after World War II, he went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts on the GI Bill. He wanted to be an actor, and he tried out for the actor studio and whatever, didn't pass the auditions, did stand-up for a while, had the stage name, and this is no joke, this is the truth, Psycho, the Exotic Neurotic.
Psycho.
That was his, Psycho. That was his name, and those things didn't work out. He didn't really stick with it, and but he had a guy. I don't know if you remember this name, Gilbert. There was a great TV writer when we were kids named Stan Burns, and he wrote for the Tonight Show, and he wrote for Get Smart, and he had a show of his own called Lancelot Link Secret Chimp, if you remember that.
Sure, with Bernie Kopell.
Yeah, he was a great comedy writer, and he, in the Army, wrote material for my father. So when I came out to California, my father said, go see Stan Burns, and I came out to California in the late 70s, and in those days, you'd pick up the phone book, right? There's no internet or computers or cell phones or anything, but people are still in the phone book. So I look up Stan Burns in the phone book. He's in Woodland Hills. I call him up. He's so nice to me. He invites me out to breakfast. I start hanging out with Stan Burns.
Wow.
I'm seeing him weekly at Dupar's for breakfast, and he's having me write jokes for him for this Gold Diggers roast that he's doing. Speaking of roasts, and I started ghostwriting jokes for him for the Gold Diggers roast, the Dean Martin celebrity roast, and a few of those jokes got on. He was really sweet, really generous to me. And about 6 months went by. And one day at Dupar's, he said, kid, I got to tell you something. And I was like, what? He said, I'm going to tell you the truth. And I'm like, okay. He's like, I have no idea who your father is. I've been racking my brains since the day we talked. I can't remember him. You're a good kid. I like you. But I have no idea who your dad is.
But he got the goods out of you first.
Now,
he did. He was a great guy, actually.
Now, your father being both a failed actor and failed comedian, how do you think that affected him, his personality, his whole...
I think he was lost after that, frankly. I think he was so consumed by show business. I think he so wanted to be a part of it. Even when I was a kid, he remained friends with... Like Jason Robards had been his drama teacher, or he was friends with the lighting guy at the Kraft Music Hall, or the associate director of the Ed Sullivan Show, and he would take me on the weekend or whatever, and he would take me and see those people, and I would go behind the scenes at all these shows all the time. It was, for me, I think it planted the seeds, but for him, he never found anything that quite captured his passion like show business did. So he was obsessed with it. Instead of, math and science and whatever, he would be asking me trivia questions about movies, about Jimmy Cagney and about Humphrey Bogart. That's what he was mostly interested in, and that's what I was filled with, And now I've been spewing it out my entire adult life.
Yeah, of course.
So did your father see your success?
My father's actually still alive.
Oh, wow!
He just was put into an assisted living facility. He's 91. He's pretty out of it now, unfortunately. Yes, he saw my success, but if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I think he had issues with it. I think he never was fully able to embrace it and be supportive of it, even though inadvertently he was my inspiration. I don't think he ever really was able to enjoy it the way he should have. I think that was something that he was not able to give himself,
That's interesting. Well, Ted, I've heard you describe the neighborhood, and you guys come from similar backgrounds, and you described it as being like a Soviet block and something out of Lord of the Flies.
Very much so. Everybody moved into Trump Village at the same time, and there were these other housing projects there, too, like Luna Park. And there were these buildings of 23-story buildings. All the kids moved in around the same time, like 63, 64. So you had like a prison kind of a number of boys growing up at the same time, and everyone is jostling for power and for dominance and for status. And a lot of people fell by the wayside. There was the bullying. When you talk about bullying in today's society, there were hundreds of bullies in my neighborhood. Everywhere you turned, if you were waiting at the bus stop, if you were getting on the train, if you were trying to play basketball, if you were going to school, there were people all the time besieging you, threatening you, intimidating you, taking your stuff, stealing your books, spitting on in your hat and making you wear it. I mean, that was growing up in my neighborhood. That was pretty normal stuff.
It is funny now that bullying is such a big topic because it was just a way of life growing up.
Exactly.
Did you experience these things, Gilbert? And you're sort of from the same neck of the woods.
I'm a tough guy.
I know that.
So,
I know you kick their asses.
so people always back off when I walk down the street.
I'm just curious from a sociological standpoint if that kind of hard scrabble life, that environment, having to, as you say, navigate these kind of tough personalities, if that molded you guys in the same way to be funny.
Well, I think I know for me, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is true for Gilbert and a lot of these guys who grew up this way, I found instinctively that I was able to talk my way out of a lot of violent situations and kind of spare myself by kind of verbalizing and kind of almost tricking them with verbal dexterity. And I think I've absolutely used that sort of learned trait. Like it's perfect. It was perfect in Borat. I'm very good at talking people into things. I'm very good at having people listen if I want them to. I can kind of like put that trance state. I can kind of do that for some reason just because I learned it from surviving on the streets of Brighton Beach, basically.
It's a talent. You mean things like persuading the Pentecostal minister, the preacher in Borat, that tricking them? I don't want to use the word tricking them, but somehow convincing them that Borat was a guy in need of saving?
Well, when I talk to someone like that in that situation, I mean, it's kind of an acting exercise for me also because I have to fully believe it. If I'm going to sell you on something, I have to kind of commit to it fully, the way a great comedian like Gilbert commits to his premise and never gives up on it and isn't afraid of what the consequences might be.
Boy, is that true.
Yeah, but it's what produces the gold, really. And the same thing is true in this situation. By setting that up properly, by having that man believe that Borat was lost and needed help, he fully committed to healing Borat. And we got a chance to witness that, which is one of the most amazing things I've personally ever seen, was this healing process.
I watched it again last night. It's magnificent.
And how did you work out that scene with Borat and the big fat guy naked in the elevator?
Well, it's funny. He came in first for the audition, and we had seen a lot of guys for this part.
Azamat.
And for Azamat. Yeah. And guys would come in who were American actors, and they would put on like Russian accents, and it was very fake sounding. And again, remember, these guys, Sasha has to be close up with real people all day long, so it can't feel fake. It's got to seem real. So we couldn't find anybody who had that kind of authenticity. He came in, Ken Divishian came in, and he was in character. And he seemed like a kind of a guy who just stumbled in from a Russian grocery on Santa Monica Boulevard or something. And I felt sorry for him. We felt bad for him. We were like trying to help him get through this audition. He didn't understand anything. And we were feeling really sorry for him. And when it was over, in his regular voice, he said, "Do you need anything else?" And he tricked us. And so he immediately got the part. But when it came time to do, and he was great, and he was really cooperative, he would do anything we asked. But when we started talking about the naked fight, he was like, "I don't get it. I don't see what's so funny about me naked." And we would just say, "Trust us. Just trust us on this."
Was Sasha tapping out at one point on the mattress, and you were ignoring him? Do I have
Absolutely.
That's right.
I'm
Get me outta
very
here.
ruthless. I'm very ruthless when it comes to shooting this stuff. You know, I don't know how many times we could do it. So I know we have to get it that one time, or we may not ever get it again. So with that, he had understandable reticence about spending a long period of time underneath Ken Davishian's ass, and he didn't want to be
As one would.
He didn't want to be trapped in that crack like a miner. You know, a miner gets trapped and there's no air pocket. He was very concerned about that. So we devised a plan where we got like a surgical mask, and as he slid under his ass, we would put the surgical mask on Sasha's mouth, and then he'd be under. And then Ken Davishian could rock on him and do all the kind of stuff. But we had a safe gesture, which was a tap out. And this last time, it was going so well, and there's audio of me like just screaming at Ken, "Keep going, keep going!" And you see Sasha's forehead, because that's all you can see, is turning beet red, and he's slamming the thing. But I'm still shooting, and I'm still shooting. And then finally we ended, and of course he's like suffocating, and we realized, wait a minute. Where's the mask? The mask disappeared. And we looked all around, and it had kind of gone up into Ken's folds. And,
Lord.
and finally emerged a couple of takes later.
Oh, my God.
So the life-saving device for Sacha Cohen was in this guy's asshole?
Exactly. Yes.
lost
It had to be very carefully extracted, as you can imagine.
Look at you talking about when you guys went to the screening and you were watching people watch that scene, and you said they were reacting like they were watching a horror movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Gilbert can really relate to this. Gilbert does this to a live audience sometimes, and I'm bowled over when he does it. I mean, you could get an audience just going completely insane when you're building on that laugh, and it's building like a wave until people are out of control. I've seen you do that on stage many, many times, and that's what that scene was like. It was like it built so much that people lost control, and I love that horror film aspect of comedy when people are having this visceral, uncontrollable, involuntary reaction to what they're watching. That, to me, is you've tapped into some kind of gold there.
Yeah, because it's really that kind of thing. Watching that scene in particular, you're going, oh no, I don't want to watch this, but I don't want to look away.
I saw it with an audience.
Yes.
What a treat to see. I mean, we were talking about, we lament on this fact, on this topic, the death of movie theaters, and how you don't get to, this is an experience that's basically endangered. Seeing movies with other people, and I saw that in a packed house. I have never seen people react. I mean, it was screaming.
Yes,
like
it was
something other than laughter. It was.
Yeah,
otherworldly.
It humbles me. I mean, when you were in the first couple of screenings that we had, we did not anticipate people freaking out. I mean, from the time that the titles come on at the beginning, the logo for the fake company that made the movie, people were laughing. And I remember Sasha and I looking at each other at one of these screenings, like, wow, we can't believe it. And it was just like a roller coaster ride. So it's just, it worked out. It just kind of clicked, And
there was something Sacha Cohen did that was almost like an experiment, almost like so revealing. When he was that character singing, he went into a honky-tonk bar.
Yes.
You want to talk about this?
Yeah, no, I didn't shoot that.
Oh, that's
that
on the
was
series.
That's not from the movie, but that is one of his famous routines. Was he goes into an Arizona bar and gets the entire crowd inside the bar to sing "Throw the Jew in the Well." And he, again, is an expert at, manipulating audiences, manipulating crowds, manipulating masses into doing his bidding. I mean, it's unsettling sometimes to watch how easily people can be manipulated if they want to be, not against their will. Everyone in all these situations that we're in with the Sacha movies has the opportunity to say no all along the way. But the social dynamic is there's so much pressure to cooperate with a camera on you and a microphone on you. It's very hard for people to not go along with the program at that point. They're in too deep,
It's more than just comedy in a way, Larry. If you break, I hate to break it down or dissect the frog, but remember Alan Abel, the hoaxer?
Of course.
Yeah.
I was a big fan of Alan Abel. I remember his movie, Is There Sex After Death?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Buck Henry was involved with him too early on.
Yes.
But it's a little bit of that too. It's you guys are making a comedy, but you're also it's all a sociological experiment.
Well, when it does its
fascinating
job
on another level.
Yeah. When it does its job, it is hopefully exposing hypocrisy and shining some kind of light on the truth of these particular situations, and but that's sort of inadvertent. You hope that happens along the way with the comedy, and you have to have the comedy in balance with that. Otherwise, it's just very, very serious. That's where the seriousness is. If you move it 10 degrees the other way, it's a very serious look at white supremacy and anti-Semitism. And we interviewed a lot of very violent people, a guy in Kansas who wound up being convicted of murders and is on death row. So there are some very serious people out there. And as it turned out, those people, we thought exposing those people would sort of show the folly and the absurdity of their positions. Instead, we're in a situation now where it's become almost societally acceptable to adopt those positions in life. So things have changed a lot.
Yeah, because when he did that, throw the Jews down the well, it's funny and frightening at the same time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, so is when he's singing when he does the national anthem, the Kazakh national anthem at the rodeo in the feature.
Yes.
It's terrifying.
There are a lot of terrifying moments, but in truth, Borat was perceived by the people that encountered him as an innocent character, and thus were much more patient with him and willing to accept his so-called ignorance. With Bruno's a much darker film, and the reason Bruno's a darker film is because the main character is kind of is a homosexual, but he's also not an innocent.
Yes.
And people had absolutely in the same way they had incredible tolerance for Borat, they had absolutely no tolerance for Bruno. People would see Bruno walk down the street and they wanted to hit him. They wanted to jostle him. They wanted to call him out. And we had so much higher level of violence and tension and darkness on that movie. That really was the lesson for us as well, because it was wound up being a very dark version of America, which we really did not anticipate at all.
Were there 50 cops called in or something like that, or 40 cops to get you guys out of was it the ultimate fighting scene?
Those were very complicated scenes. There was a lot of police involved. We also had police chasing us most of the time. Really, it was we rarely had the police on our side. They were usually coming after us.
Bruno, we're talking about now.
On both Bruno and
movies.
Borat, we always had Borat. One of the best scenes that is not in the movie is we went to Washington D.C. and we would take the ice cream truck and we would just drive around near these national monuments and stuff, and we realized Borat looks, he's got the black mustache.
Sure.
And all of us were in the back of the ice cream truck with our cameras and black bags. And suddenly we looked like we could be terrorists in an ice cream truck. What the hell are we doing in an ice cream truck at the Washington Monument? So suddenly the Secret Service would be on us, or the FBI would come up to us, and we were constantly being approached and confronted and detained quite often by the authorities.
High stress.
In that particular case that you're talking about at the cage fight, the police had to help. The police had to help us get out. Yeah.
Well, Dan Mazer, one of the writers on Borat, I was reading an interview with him, and he said every day was like actually preparing for a bank robbery.
Exactly.
Such high stress.
High stress, high stakes.
Right.
But by the same token, when we were done and we got away with it, there was nothing more exhilarating than the feeling of having gotten away with it. And we would get back in the van and we would be like giddy with laughter because we had actually we went into a bank. We did a scene in a bank where it was just us and the bank president in Oklahoma after hours, and I'm thinking, man, if we just pull out guns right now, we could rob this bank as well as make the movie. Why not,
And there was something in the dangerous world of comedy that kind of thing, you're watching a lot of people cross the line, but there was that one guy who was just spewing anti-Semitic, it was just, hatred of the Jews.
Yes, Weave, his name was.
Yeah.
Weave, yeah. He's like kind of he and Baked Alaska were both kind of these white nationalist social media comedians, and I wanted to get that perspective. It was much harder to get. I chased after a lot of alt-right comedians, and I could not get too many to sit down and actually talk to me. Those two guys were willing to talk, to their credit, but in the case of Weave, he almost doesn't have control, it seemed to me. It's almost like one of these kind of Tourette-like things with him when he went off on his anti-Semitic rants. And it didn't even seem, it seemed like it was a kind of just a spewing rather than even thoughtful, like something that he just does like a Tourette's person curses, you know?
Do you ever, maybe this is a naive question, Larry, do you recall fearing for your life while making this new series? Standing on that darkened street, for instance, talking to Butt Naked?
There was 2 or 3 times when I thought I may have made a mistake.
In too deep.
One was in Iraq. We were going to Kirkuk, which had been besieged by ISIS, and we were going there to an Iraqi prison where an ISIS prisoner was, and I was going to interview the ISIS prisoner. And when we got stuck in like kind of a checkpoint. Mosul was falling the same day that we had to do this. So we could see the smoke from the Battle of Mosul going on while we were trying to get to Kirkuk, and there was kind of chaos on the road. And I thought, boy, what do we, we're trapped really in this situation. And so it worked out okay. We went to the prison and talked to the ISIS prisoner, which was fascinating. But I was nervous that day. The next time it happened was with Butt Naked. Because we had just gotten to Liberia and knew nothing about anything, and they told us he would meet us at night on the street. And I jumped into it and realized, wow, we're totally vulnerable here.
Of course.
I haven't checked anything out. We haven't, done anything. And it's dark, and I don't know what's going to happen. The third time, which was the most intense time, was in Mogadishu. In Mogadishu, there were a number of times where we would get caught in a checkpoint situation, and there would just be dozens of men with machine guns, and they'd be all wearing camo, but slightly different color camo, and you had all these different groups with arms, and you didn't know whose side, whose side you were on, whose side was going to open fire. There was a lot of that tension the entire time we were in Somalia. And as soon as we left, there was like a bomb blast at a bus in Mogadishu that killed like 550 people. So I felt very lucky to have walked away from that one because I would not advise going as a tourist to Somalia. However, it's a beautiful country, and hopefully someday they'll figure it out.
And there was the ISIS prisoner.
Yes.
It was so weird to look at him because you say, this is a guy who looks like he works the cash register at 7-Eleven.
Yes. I think that was one of the things I was glad to be able to illuminate was we tend to demonize these people. We don't know anything about them. We paint them as villains, and we have a kind of a one-dimensional mindset about what they are. But this guy was saying he was a farmer. He had been recruited. He had been threatened. It's like the makeup of the actual people who are in ISIS is actually much more human. They live under these incredible conditions where they have to respond either to join ISIS or to fight against it. They can't just go on with their lives like we get a chance to do. So they have to make these hard decisions, and a lot of them wound up fighting and getting caught. And now they're in prison, and like at Guantanamo, all the people that are not charged there. So it's a bad cycle that there's no in Somalia. You have Al-Shabaab, which is another sort of version of that terrorist group. And we met a defector from Al-Shabaab, and I asked him also what they found funny. He had some interesting answers. Yep. When they dragged the bodies of the enemies behind the truck, that's what used to make them laugh.
Well, we're gonna tell our listeners to check this out, and we'll come back to it at the end. But February 15th,
sure.
Right?
Yes,
February 15th on Netflix. It is utterly fascinating.
Thank you.
And now let's get to how you started working in TV with Seinfeld. Let's go.
Okay. Well, Seinfeld, I knew Larry David from Fridays. and we had become immediate friends. He's a little older than me. We're from the same neighborhood. He immediately became like a big brother and mentor type of figure to me, and really showed me a lot about writing and discipline and things like that at Fridays. We collaborated on a lot of stuff. We remained friends after Fridays. If I would hear of a job, I would recommend him for it, and vice versa. Eventually, sometime after Norman's Corner, he
had to bring that up again,
which I was not asked to work on. He did this. He hooked up with Jerry, and they started to do this thing, and it became obviously the show Seinfeld Chronicles at that time.
Right,
originally developed. I mean, the whole mythology and the legend is all well known. It was developed for late night and all this. He showed me, he came out, Larry, to the Bellage Hotel at that time to show the 3 or 4 scripts he had written to Castle Rock, who were going to produce the show. And he invited me over to his hotel, and I read those 4 scripts in the lobby. And they were like the robbery, the ex-girlfriend, the Chinese restaurant. You know, there was another one too, I can't remember, the phone message maybe. And I was laughing in the lobby. I'd never read anything that funny. They were just so unique and so original. And he asked me to work on the show, and I said yes. And but Castle Rock said no. And they said that Larry had no experience except for Norman's Corner, which of course worked against him.
Nice work, Gil.
Almost killed Seinfeld, Norman's Corner. Just think about that. But they said that he had never done a sitcom before, and I had never done a sitcom before, so they would not. Larry, of course, was the creator of the show, but they refused to hire me. So I was cast adrift for a while, and I got a job on the Arsenio Hall show, which I think I again saw you at the Arsenio Hall show at some point.
I became like kind of a regular for a short period of time.
I was a writer. I was a writer that year, and so I would see you. I don't know if I even talked to you, but I saw you all the time, and you were great. Obviously, always great. But I was working on that show, and Arsenio, to his credit, had wanted to do kind of edgy monologues, but when he actually got to be the host of the show, he was a black man in a very white medium, and he started to get hate mail that was out of control. And if a white woman came on the show and he just shook her hand, there would be hate mail. Switchboard would light up, you know. That's what you had then, a switchboard, you know. It was kind of a little old-fashioned. So my jokes, he wouldn't use my jokes because they were just too radical, really. He liked them. He told me he thought they were funny, but he couldn't use them. And I knew I was going to get fired eventually. And that's when I met Jack Nicholson, when I had that encounter.
Oh, glad I was just going to get to that. That was the magical Jack Nicholson encounter.
Yeah, I walked out of the trailer where we did the writing on Arsenio knowing that my contract was up. I was about to have a baby, and it was like things were really pretty bad, and I was looking for some kind of sign, and Jack Nicholson was on the lot on Paramount doing the 2 Jakes. And I see in the distance this beautiful red Mercedes convertible, and I see the Laker hat, and it's like, wow, Jack Nicholson is cruising right past me. And as we cruised past, he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he just started laughing and just went, yeah, it's funny, and just kept going. And I thought, wow. I just had a Zen moment with Jack Nicholson, and sure enough, I was fired immediately right after that. And I actually got an interview, amazingly enough, with Keenan Ivory Wayans on In Living Color.
Oh, In Living Color.
And I went to that interview, and Keenan stood me up. And I was the kind of person at that time who really had a short temper with that kind of stuff. And I stormed out of the meeting. I stormed out of the waiting room. And when I got home, Larry was calling me because now they had done like the first 4 episodes.
Right.
And they were getting picked up for the 13th. And he's like, hey, man, you want to come work on the show? You can come work on the show now. And I was like, yeah, I'm free, you know. And I took the job on the show. Keenan Ivory Wayans called me back after that and said, hey, man, I'm so sorry. There was a scheduling mix-up. Please come in. We really want to work with you. And I was like, I took this other job already. And that's how I wound up working on Seinfeld.
Having a short temper got you to work on Seinfeld.
And because Jack Nicholson intervened.
Yes.
And
Divine intervention.
it's interesting, like how Castle Rock, they didn't want you because you didn't have that much experience. And didn't Larry David go out of his way to hire people who didn't have experience writing sitcoms?
Absolutely. Well, you know that the second or third season, we didn't have a traditional writing staff ever that I was there. Later on, after I left, I think things got a little bit, the formula, the code had been cracked, and they were able to kind of create a culture that they could kind of replicate the show. But in those first couple of years, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. We didn't even know how to write a sitcom. We didn't know the format for the sitcom. We didn't know how many scenes or anything. We didn't know how to tell the story.
Amazing.
We just did. We did what we thought was funny. We thought the show would get canceled. It liberated us, and we were just kind of figuring out as we went along. And so Larry thought comedians would be good people to draw stories from. So we had a whole staff of road comedians at one point who contributed stories to the show because, again, they were not writers in the traditional sense, but they were people that had very Seinfeldian kind of adventures.
People like Bob Shaw and people like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bob Shaw, Bill Masters, John Heyman.
Right. I know Heyman.
Steve Scrovan.
Sure, funny guys, all of them.
Yeah, all great guys.
Yeah.
All great guys.
I mean, I remember what was fun around that time is the times I would talk to Larry David, and he'd just tell me some horror story that happened in his life, usually having to do with trying to get laid.
Yes.
And then I would see a few weeks later it pop up on the show.
Yes.
And I thought, wow, I know where this came from.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, part of it is the pressure of coming up with 22 or 24 episodes in a season. That's almost crazy. So he was very courageous and brave, as he always has been, in drawing directly from his autobiography, drawing from his life. So he would literally have bad dates or awkward encounters, or I'd be with him like in Arts Deli, and we would come out, and the woman at the cashier didn't have any change, and she had to run backstage to get change, came back and gave us the change, and we went outside on Ventura Boulevard. We bumped into somebody that we'd been avoiding for 20 years. So it's like those kind of stories. If she had just had the change,
Like a crazy Joe Davola character.
All
Right.
those things were like happening,
Right.
either had happened or were happening, and we were constantly pulling on those things to make stories out of them and figure out how to structure them into what became a Seinfeld episode.
And the story about George Costanza being in a girl's apartment and having to take a shit and having
Right.
to excuse himself had happened to Larry.
That's a completely true story, and when he said that, he had told me that story before thinking about it for Seinfeld, and I always thought that is the funniest thing I've ever heard. I cannot believe it. He actually he would forego sex because he wanted to go back to his apartment to have a bowel movement, and that's Larry, though, as we know. But he was brave enough to think that's a great idea for an episode. As a matter of fact, one of the episodes Larry and Jerry used to share an office at Radford, and then I had an office like adjacent to them. Their office had a private bathroom, and if you didn't have that private bathroom, you had to go out to the hallway to that crappy bathroom in the hallway. So I just completely obliviously would use their bathroom for everything. And they'd be working, they'd be writing, and I would stroll in with I'd stroll in with a magazine, literally, and I'd go, hey, how you doing? And I would go into their bathroom and go sit there for 15 minutes or whatever. And I didn't realize they were getting pissed off at me, But the brilliance of the show is that we wound up using that as an episode. That's the episode which also combines a number of other Larry incidents. The episode where he gets fired and then comes back to work, pretends it doesn't happen. That's a true story from Saturday Night Live.
SNL, yes.
Yeah.
And it's funny that he went out of his way to hire people who hadn't worked on sitcoms, because had he hired people with those experiences, it would have been a a situation comedy like a billion others.
Exactly.
And
well,
the
he
stories
had to fight.
would,
I was just going to say, not to interrupt, I apologize. He would fight, and I would back him up always. He would fight with the Castle Rock executives and the NBC executives because they wanted something more traditional. The Chinese restaurant was literally about the four of them waiting for a table. Nothing else happened initially. And they fought and fought about some kind of storyline. And we finally added, well, they're waiting for a movie, and they're going to be late for the movie. But really, Larry wanted to deconstruct the form. Even without thinking about it, his instinct was to deconstruct the form, And it's true, if we had followed the Castle Rock advice or the NBC advice, the show would not have been what it became. It would have been a much more traditional, rote, predictable type of sitcom.
And instead, you're breaking new ground. Was it the first episode you wrote or the second one where Jerry's shot in his own apartment? He's gunned down because he's stealing cable?
Well, I love the idea of being able to, that's what's so great about Jerry and Larry and why I love them and revere them, really, because they allowed me to do stuff like that. They encouraged me to do things like that. And we were all thinking of ways of breaking the form and changing the form and expanding the form and expanding the language of what's funny and what's a sitcom. And they really encouraged me to sort of follow my path on that show.
Yeah. It's great, too. Let's ask you about and you've been asked about this a million times, but about the episode, the gun episode, the one that never made it to air.
Right. Well, that was I look at that now as my failure as a writer. I think Larry he would inspire me because he would take subjects that, like masturbation, and he would find a way of writing an episode about it that was compelling and funny and didn't even get any notes from standards and
it was
practices.
able to be done in network television.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the
and I was always looking to push that envelope. And I had this idea about Elaine buying a gun. I had met a number of women during that time who were contemplating buying guns. And I thought this is an interesting thing. And I put together an episode, but the episode, although it had funny moments in it, and it had some very startling moments in it, it was not successful as a coherent episode. And once there's no laughter in a story like that, it became very, very grim. And I could not, Larry and Jerry would often let my episodes be whatever they were, and it usually worked out okay. I mean, they didn't have to do a lot of work on my episodes. They seemed to be cool with it, or they would do a kind of a quick pass at it. This, they didn't know what to do with, and I didn't know what to do with. And I think that the starkness of the story under those conditions made it hard to sell to the actors and to the network. And so even though we had cast it and we were sort of along the way of that episode, we had to pull the plug on it.
It's a shame.
What other plots and stories had you written that couldn't make it on the air? Do you remember any of the others?
I wrote one early on about George, like with Mario Joyner, and they're at the diner, and Mario Joyner orders a salad, and George said, wow, I never saw a black person order a salad before. And that was just like a no-go. I wrote the episode. It was actually funny. That one actually was funny, but it was very, very sensitive. But also what's interesting is like the contest, the masturbation episode, and the outing, which I wrote, were both episodes that had been conceived of the season before, and NBC and Castle Rock were just not ready at that time to go for it. By the time the show started to kind of settle in, they were okay with us doing episodes like that also. Right. So some of those episodes could have fallen by the wayside very easily, and you wouldn't have the contest or the outing or that whole season, really, which is a really great season, I think.
I love that you guys are bringing your own little passions to the show, too, like Dragnet in your case, or
exactly.
or Abbott
Superman.
and Costello and Superman.
Yes. Abbott and Costello was a very important part of the show.
There's a character named Sidney Fields, for Christ's sake.
That's right. We were constantly doing little allusions and references to things like that. We love doing that.
Yeah, or that Newman is basically Joe Besser, that Newman is stinky.
Exactly.
Because the Abbott and Costello show, that was, like, their movies were like, very hit and miss. They'd have funny parts. The show is fascinating.
It's dark.
Yes.
It's strangely dark and surreal.
Yes.
I've said that it's almost like a Beckett play.
It really is. I don't
they
know
live
what
in
they
this
were.
weird rooming house. You know, they got the weird landlord. They don't really have jobs. They're waiting for something.
Yeah.
You don't know what.
Yeah.
They're also much older in the TV show, which changes the perspective so much.
Yes.
When they're young and buck privates, they got their whole lives ahead of them. Now they're broken down bums in suits
With people
living
running-
in a boarding house with one bedroom. You know.
And Abbott has a pot belly.
But they're also victimized by sudden outbursts of violence. Just
Constantly by
erratic
strangers.
behavior by strangers pounding on them and beating them.
And I love that stuff. I mean, when the woman comes up to Lou Costello and hits him because she says, "How dare you remind me of somebody I hate?" You know, that's
Gold.
those kind of moments. We tried to have those non sequitur type of moments in Seinfeld as well for our own amusement, but people seem to get a kick out of it as well.
And I remember Jerry at one point in one of the shows going, boys.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, some stooges
absolutely.
too. Jerry would get between Kramer and
yes.
George and do a Mo thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a whole the fathers of mother. We did that bit actually in one of the episodes.
Right.
We did a lot of references to Abbott Costello and to Superman and to Dragnet. I would say that was the big three. Really.
Yeah.
Like the three of us all grew up on the same television.
Absolutely.
Of like the Bowery Boys, Abbott and
Yes.
Costello, the Stooges.
Yes.
Whole Mac and Meyer for hire.
Yes.
I mean like cheap,
absolutely,
cheap knockoffs of
Yes.
Abbott and Costello.
Well, you know, when I first moved to Hollywood, I lived I lived behind the Chinese Theater, and I used to kind of wander around, and I used to bump into Huntz Hall. Now, for me, Huntz Hall was a gigantic star. So I was starstruck, but he lived in some apartment on Hollywood Boulevard, and I bump into him, and I get a chance to talk to him and hang out with him and take a walk with him, and I got to be friendly with Huntz Hall for a while, which, again, as a Bowery Boys freak, was incredibly exciting to me. I remember he did a TV show late in life with Gabriel Dell. It was like they were both gangsters. I can't remember the name of the show now.
Chicago Teddy Bears?
The Chicago Teddy Bears.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I remember being so excited that show was coming
Oh
up.
my God!
Art Matrano, right?
We had him on this
right.
podcast.
Yeah.
Now, was he thrilled that you recognized him?
Yes, always. Anybody that I bumped into like that, because I was like, because of my father, kind of inculcating me with all that trivia, I recognized everybody when I would go, because at that time, even Schwab's was still open when I first moved here. And you go to Schwab's and Chuck McCann was there and Timothy Carey and all kinds of great character
names.
actors were still hanging out. And so I got a chance to talk to all those guys. I would go up to them and actually say hello because I thought I have to do that. You know, I have to take that leap.
Now, when Seinfeld was at its peak, you know, much like I always say with Airplane and Naked Gun, there were a million movies coming out that would watch the success of those movies and go, okay, we'll base it on other movies and we'll
throw
put
Leslie Nielsen into it.
Yeah, we'll throw in Leslie Nielsen. We think we have the formula, but they never did. And there were a million Seinfeld knockoffs that it's like you could tell were watched by people who watched Seinfeld and thought, oh, okay, I get it.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that what happened was Seinfeld was kind of an accident. You know, I think that if the network executives, if it had been brought through the process the way most normal sitcoms do, it never would have made it through intact. I think the network executives loved the success of Seinfeld, but were very afraid of the content and the themes and the darkness. No morals, no hugging, you know?
Yeah.
And I think those things went very much against the grain for network executives. So when they would try to replicate the success, they would remove the very things that made it funny in the first place.
They also didn't have Larry David.
That made a difference as well.
They didn't have a singular comic mind.
There is only one Larry David. Yeah. That's true.
Here's something jumping in another direction.
Yes.
But still concentrating on Seinfeld, which now you obviously knew Michael Richards.
Yes.
Now, what do you think of everything that happened with him?
I feel, well, so much has happened since then in terms of that subject matter. Like, that was the first time really somebody had been kind of caught on a video camera or a phone camera, sort of doing something that was considered inappropriate, and it kind of took off on its own and caught fire on its own. I felt a couple of things. I felt that he was, as I think you'll sympathize and recognize and relate to, he was bombing. It was like late at night. He was bombing. He was desperate. He is not the most, he's not the easiest person to just be himself. So as he's bombing, I think he's retreating into characters, looking for some way out, and wound up stumbling into this angry redneck character and spewing the N-word, which was a mistake. But I think if he had said, man, I was bombing, and I spewed this word out in desperation, and it was a total mistake, and I regret it, I think that would have probably been the end of it. But he kind of did this apology tour, which almost exacerbated the issue more than it needed to be, and I think that wound up hurting him almost as much as the incident himself.
Because I remember that Seinfeld had him call up, I guess, Letterman. And while Seinfeld was on, and he apologized, and his apology, the audience was laughing.
Yes.
They thought, this is Kramer doing a crazy thing.
People don't know that Michael is not Kramer, that Kramer is a manifestation of an aspect of Michael. And Michael himself is a very introverted, self-reflective type of person. And I think it was very awkward for him to be on David Letterman. It was very awkward for him to have to even talk as himself. And then he got sort of caught up in the verbiage that sort of made things even worse. If Jerry had done something like that and had gone on David Letterman, he could have handled it because he knows how to handle that situation in public. I don't think Michael was equipped to do that. And I think that's what you saw as somebody who really was not prepared to handle the onslaught. Today, there would be PR people. There would be a whole, there would be a whole plan in place before he would even make a public appearance. But in those days, he tried to be honest and, and be very forthright about it, and wound up backfiring on him. He's a very good person. He's a very nice person.
Just on the subject of Larry David, before we jump off, Larry, we're going all over the place. Curb Your Enthusiasm, another show that you've been intimately involved with. And we could ask you anything about this, but we do want to make sure that we get to our friend Bob Einstein.
Yes.
And maybe you can say a couple of things about him.
Before I get to Bob, which I'm happy to do, and he was an amazing person, I felt very lucky to get a chance to work with him because, again, I was a fan of his from Officer Judy on the Smothers Brothers.
Of course.
So really, he was one of the greats to me. But just another word about Larry and Curb Your Enthusiasm. He was saying how he had the instinct to hire non-sitcom writers to do Seinfeld. Well, in the same way, he came to me after doing the pilot of Curb, which I appeared in, and he said, once it was picked up for series, he said, you should direct one of these. And I had never directed anything at that point. So even there, he had the instinct to say to me, I know you could do a good job with this. And he actually made me a director.
Oh, we should point that out. Yeah, that's important.
I think that's very important. It also goes to this thing you referred to, his instinct for unusual people that he thinks are going to actually make the thing special. And I really appreciated that, both on Seinfeld and on Curb. He did two things for me that probably had the biggest impact on my adult life, really.
And you directed me some of the best ones, too. The Nanny with Sherry O'Terry, and thank you for your service, and so many good ones.
And
thank you.
Another thing that breaks a rule with Curb is that I remember hearing people talk saying, well, if we've got this character who's like very abrasive and mean, we got to show something that justifies it. Like the other were mean to him and he's getting back so we can root for him. With Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David's basically, he's a petty prick.
A misanthrope.
Yeah. You don't go, gee, I really like this guy. You go, no, he's a neurotic fuck.
Yes, it's true. I think that he did something also, though, in both Seinfeld and in Curb, he tapped into this dark undercurrent, this id id that we have that we don't like to really admit to. These sort of petty thoughts, these small-minded, vengeance-filled, dark thoughts. This is what sort of drives him. He's able to sort of separate that and make that into stories, but that's tapped into something that the audience had never really had a chance to experience or react to in television comedy.
You've seen that we've talked about it on this show, for lack of a better term, neurotic Jewish humor. I mean, the humor of Woody Allen, Philip Roth, Bruce J. Friedman, all of these. You hadn't really seen it in primetime television.
Yes, that's true.
To that
that's
point,
true.
It was still a fresh thing.
But he found a way in both of those series to make it palatable.
Yeah,
but
I was just going to say, the last thing I was going to say about that is just that what I found so shocking was, I think one of the big complaints about Seinfeld initially was it's going to be about these Jewish single New Yorkers and who's going to relate to it. But that was one of the mistaken assumptions about the show. The more specific it was about their circumstances, the more people related to it, and the more people would come up to me and go, they'd be from Kansas or Iowa, and they go, hey, my best friend's just like George. Or I know a Kramer, and it turned out that people, and then when I went overseas, and I'd be like in Israel or, wherever these countries, there would be somebody, you got to meet this guy, he's just like George. So everybody around the world has those archetypal people in their life. Right. And that was something you could not possibly predict.
And now they're selling the DVDs in Baghdad.
Exactly, exactly. Next to Mein Kampf.
What I always found fascinating about Seinfeld was that on the show, I mean, it's got such a Jewish sensibility about it, such a Jewish identity, and yet the only Jewish character is Jerry Seinfeld.
Correct.
I mean,
correct.
The Costanzas are the Jewiest group of Italians.
Played by Jews.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
All three of them.
Yes. Yes, that's very true.
Right.
And you go, okay, we're supposed to believe these are Italians.
Yeah, there was a buy there. Well, again, in the New York sort of ethnic world, those things very much overlap. So again, for the rest of the country, it struck a chord somehow, and it made it seem very real and relatable. So they transcended their Judaism almost immediately,
We want to ask you about two great Jews. One is Robert Zimmerman, which we'll get to. But tell us something about Bob.
Bob Einstein, absolutely.
He did this show. We've done 200 of these, Larry. He did this one of our favorite episodes. He basically came in here and tore us apart.
Yeah, he hit the ground running, and I mean, we barely had enough time to ask him a question.
We'll send you a link. It's fun.
Yeah, please do. I don't know that he is, God rest his soul. I don't think that he was ever not on. As soon as he hit the ground, he was running. He would walk onto the set and he'd be grabbing you to tell you some long, and it was like you, only not on stage. He would commit to a long, dirty joke, and he wouldn't let you leave until it was done. They're waiting for you on the set. They're ready to shoot, but he had to get to the punchline. He was one of a kind. That family is, of course, comedy royalty, no question about it.
They are.
Between Albert Brooks and Bob and their father as well.
Right.
But I enjoyed, like I said, Officer Judy. I was a gigantic Super Dave fan.
Us too.
Yeah.
He was a kind of a real comedy auteur. He was one of those people. So I admired his work, and I had a great time. One of the great things about Curb is I got to work with a lot of classic comedy people like Mel Brooks and Paul Mazursky and Bob Einstein. I got to direct them. I mean, that stuff is dream come true stuff.
The kid from Brighton Beach who worshiped Mel Brooks is now directing Mel Brooks.
Incredible.
Surreal, right?
Incredible, yeah. Incredible experience, yeah.
Now Gilbert got a kick out of, we talk a little bit about Masked and Anonymous, but again, a fascinating person for you to have collaborated with is Bob Dylan.
Another old Jew. He's
another old Jew.
Yes.
How the hell
if you think of him that way, then you get him.
Well, Gilbert really loved the fact that I found this in my research, that he went through a Jerry Lewis phase, which is mind-blowing.
That's where I come in. That's where I come in. I got a call from his manager that he's still on this what they call the Never Ending Tour. And back in the 80s and the 90s, and I guess the early 2000s, when VHS was the medium, on his tour bus, he had a VHS machine and a TV. And at one point, in the early 2000s, he got obsessed with Jerry Lewis. And he would like go do a concert, get back in the bus, and watch a Jerry Lewis movie till they got to the next town. And he suddenly realized he wanted to do, and this is how Bob is. He decided he wanted to do a slapstick comedy like Jerry Lewis.
That's a whole new bit for you, Gilbert.
Hey, lady.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, Mr. Mishnik. I'll watch the gas station for you.
So he became completely consumed with this idea. His manager called and said, "Do you want to talk to Bob?" And I was like, for me, I thought, well, I'll have a meeting with Bob Dylan. That'll be really exciting. I can go brag to all my friends that I met Bob Dylan. And I said, sure. I went to the meeting, and he had a boxing ring in Santa Monica, boxing gym, and he had a little cubicle there. And I met with him in the cubicle, and he had a box, and he opened the box. It was filled with scrap paper, and he opened it up, and all the scrap paper came out. It all had like different little expressions and lines and names, and he's like, I don't know what to do with all this. And I was like, I picked up a piece of paper. I said, well, this could be the name of a character, and this could be a line that the character says. And then he's like, you could do that? And I was like, yeah. So we started working on this thing, this kind of slapstick TV series that he was going to star in.
Unbelievable.
And while I was trying to envision it in my mind, like, what was this going to be like, But we wrote it. We wrote an actual version of it. It was very surreal. I don't know how funny it was, but we wrote it, and we were told that HBO might be interested. So we went to HBO, and in those days, I wore only pajamas. I used to wear pajamas. Like when I was on Mad About You, which is another time that we worked together, Gilbert. You were on Mad About You in the dog park.
Yes.
It's all coming back.
I was the showrunner of Mad About You at that time, and I used to wear pajamas. I wore them all the time because on Mad About You, I was working like 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. It was absurd. So I was like, the hell with it. I was like Vincent Gigante. I was walking around.
The chin.
Yes.
Pajamas. And so we decided we'd go to HBO, and I said, Bob, if you were to come to the meeting, they would never say no to you. They'll buy the pitch right in the office there. And so he agreed to that. So I showed up in pajamas. He, at that time, was very into the Western wear. So he showed up in a beautiful cowboy hat and a floor-length black duster, like something out of Duel in the Sun. That's what he looked like. And we strode across the courtyard at HBO at that time in Century City and went into the meeting. And he immediately walked past everybody in the meeting in Chris Albrecht's office and went to the picture window at the end of the office and just stared out at the skyline the entire meeting, never said a word. So I was like left pitching, going, well, Bob will do this, Bob will do that, right, Bob? And he would turn around and go, yeah. And he might answer maybe. And despite the awkwardness of that meeting, they bought the show. And we went out to the elevator, and we were all ecstatic, except for Bob. He seemed very forlorn. And it's like, what's the matter? He's like, I don't want to do this anymore. It's too slapsticky. And so
wow.
That ended that iteration of that project. But the idea of working with Bob Dylan, I would have done it for the rest of my life, frankly, to tell you the truth. And so, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just say, I wish to God that had been made a slapstick comedy starring Bob Dylan.
The world needs it. By the way, that's the way he is in a meeting, too.
Yeah.
Gilbert.
Yes.
Stares out the window and grunts. Dara, am I right about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
But we wound up working on it, continuing to work on it, and evolving. It evolved into this other thing that became Master Anonymous,
which is fascinating. Which I have to tell our listeners to watch.
I remember the Mad About You I was on. I was a guy who goes up to Paul Reiser at the dog park, and I'm asking to feel his dog's testicles. That was, and when it went into syndication, that was cut out.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
That's hilarious, actually. I did not know that. I did not. I remember you doing that. I didn't remember the dog's testicles, but now that you mention it, actually, we had some rough weeks there. You know, we were trying to get some laughs. It was hard sometimes.
Larry, can I ask you a question from a fan?
Certainly.
This is something we do called Grill the Guest, which people can do on Patreon. Sean Liu, he says, hey, I got a question for Larry. Bob Sacamano is one of the great unseen characters in the history of television.
Yeah.
Was there ever a temptation or a push by execs to hire an actor to actually bring him to life or portray him?
Well, first of all, as most of the people on Seinfeld, as it's true of most of the people on Seinfeld, most of the characters' names, he's a real person.
Right.
So Robert Sacamano actually exists. He's a friend of mine from Trump Village. I know him since third grade. So he's a real person. He was not happy, actually, to become Bob Sacamano, this kind of cult figure.
Oh, really?
Weird. Yeah, he was uncomfortable. But I'm sure there was talk of it maybe at one point or another, but it was one of those things that really worked. Newman originally was an unseen character, but we needed for story, we needed to see him, and Wayne came in and did such a great audition that Newman became a character on the show very organically. There was no real plan, but with Bob Sacamano, nothing really came up that seemed like it was funnier to have him be the unseen friend than to actually visualize him.
Well, it's kind of like, you know, when they start bringing imaginary characters to life, and it's like when they had Mrs. Columbo. You know, you always love Peter Falk saying, my wife, she spilled something on, and that was funny. This person you heard Columbo talk about. But then when she became real, it's like, you know, what the fuck is this?
Part of the culture of Seinfeld after a while was figuring out Lloyd Braun was a real person, and Joe Davola was a real person, and Bob Sacamano was a real person, and so many. Yeah,
it's true.
Or the writers' names would turn up sometimes.
Absolutely. Most of those people were very happy to be name-checked. Even if they were playing a psychotic character with their name, they were usually pretty thrilled about it.
Yeah.
And they found a guy, I think he was a friend of Larry's, named George Costanza.
I think he's a friend of Jerry's, actually, yes.
Oh, there's a Kenny Kramer, too.
Well, you must have known Gilbert. I'm sure you knew Kenny Kramer.
Oh, yes.
Is he still around, Kenny Kramer?
He's around.
Yeah, character.
Yeah.
That was
when I was a teenager, and I would go up to the Catskills, and I think, Gilbert, you could probably confirm this, he was one of the biggest comedians at that time. He was actually kind of an up-and-coming, very popular comedian, and actually very arrogant in those days in the Catskills, because he was kind of the big star, you know? He would do all those showcases, and he was getting a name for himself, and I remember him very well from that period. That's when Marvin Braverman and...
I know that name.
They were all doing the stand-up at that time. It was kind of fun in the Catskills at that point.
Well, was the other guy around, too? The guy with Barbara Feldon, your friend?
Oh, Buddy Mantilla.
Buddy Mantilla?
Buddy Mantilla.
Yeah, another guy. The Untouchables.
Yeah, the Untouchables.
Yes,
with
yes.
Bobby
I saw them at the Brickman Showcase. You know, I was a bellhop at the Brickman, and I saw them perform at the Brickman Showcase. And Malzy Lawrence used to host the Pines Showcase.
There's a funny man.
Yeah.
Here, watch this segue. Speaking of comedy teams, since we just talked about the Untouchables, and by the way, this is also on behalf of our engineer, Frank Verderosa. We love the comedians.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
There was some very funny stuff in there, and
really funny.
It just did not click for whatever reason. I don't know why. I know there was funny stuff. Those two guys were great together. It just did not appeal to anybody. I can't explain it, really. I thought that it would be satisfying to an audience, but it never really coincided with the audience.
The fun idea of the mismatched comedy duo, you know?
Yeah.
The Sunshine Boys kind of idea.
Both those guys were willing to be very dark about their personas also. Yeah.
And our friend Steve Weber does a nice turn on that show as well.
Steve Weber's great, yes.
Yeah. But we do want to ask you, since Abbott and Costello came up, and this one's for you, Gil.
Yeah.
Have you seen the Bud and Lou TV movie with Buddy Hackett and Harvey Korman?
Yes.
I of course I have, but not for a long time.
Favorite topic.
We would be remiss if we didn't ask Larry. The expert on comedy.
I haven't seen Stan and Ollie. Have you seen Stan
Yeah,
and
it's
Ollie,
pretty good.
Gilbert?
No,
or
I
Frank?
haven't seen it yet. I want to.
It's good. They take a lot of liberties with the facts, which troubles me
Yeah.
a little bit, and purists.
Ollie
but
is black.
Yeah, and
Ollie's
Stan
played by
is a
Jack
woman
Sue.
now.
Yeah.
A transgender woman. Yes.
It's sweet and sentimental, and the performances are great. It obviously has great affection for them, so it's worth
Yeah.
seeing. Yeah.
Stan Laurel was another person. You know, a lot of these people like Larry Fine and Stan Laurel, they were living out here in Los Angeles when I first came out here, and they were in the. I think Larry Fine was in the Actors Home.
Yeah.
They were around, and
Laurel was in Santa Monica.
Other comedians, other comedy writers would tell me that I went to visit Larry Fine, or he sent me a letter, or you could really connect with those people. Now, Joe Bolton, some of those guys back in New York, the WPIX guys, that was a different story. I was on a lot of those. My mother used to take me to be in the audience in the Peanut Gallery, like for Bozo.
This is great.
And Sonny Fox.
We had Sonny Fox
Wonderama.
here. We had him on
You
the show.
did?
We had him on
Oh,
the
my
podcast,
God.
and we had Chuck McCann.
Yeah,
Chuck
McCann was great.
Tom Bergeron was on the show, and he told us that when he was a little kid, he looked up both Larry and Moe and visited them.
Yeah.
Yes, they were accessible. And it's. I think back to. I remember, on Hollywood Boulevard, like I said, you'd see Hunts Hall. You'd also see Aldo Ray waiting for a bus.
Aldo Ray.
And believe me, he wanted somebody to recognize him, and he was thrilled. We used him on Fridays. We would sometimes find these guys pretty down and out on Hollywood Boulevard and put them in a sketch on Fridays.
I lived in L.A. for a decade, and it was one of the great sports when you had days to kill, when you had nothing to do, is you'd go to the farmer's market and run into the guys like Louis Gus. Remember Louis Gus?
Yes,
from
of course.
Moonstruck?
Yeah.
You just see these people and feel compelled to run up to them, and
Yes.
it was like currency that you knew who they were.
Well, I was thinking on the way over here about comedians that we know all the great comedians, and we could all probably give the same 4 or 5 great comedians. But I started thinking about comedians that only we might know at this point. Guys like Morty Gunty,
Sure.
who are like kind of popular. Or who's a very influential comedian? I think on you, certainly on me as well, and I think on most modern comedy doesn't get the credit really is Jackie Mason. He was a very important comedian for a very long time. And there's a lot of those Catskill guys who were really sharp and funny and original, who are kind of, we remember, and we've kind of used their influences to sort of grow it a little bit further. But some of those guys, Jackie Vernon.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we talk about Jackie Vernon on
all
this
those
show.
There's Ed Sullivan comedians who would be on, like Timmy Brown. Oh, yeah. Do you remember him?
Yes. Timmy Rogers.
Timmy Rogers.
Timmy Rogers, yes, thank you.
Everybody
Right.
wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And then he would, and with each punchline was, "Oh yeah,
Oh yeah, that was his punchline. That was his catchphrase.
London Lee.
London Lee was great. Saw him many times. The rich kid, the poor little rich kid. That was his hook.
How about
His
Morty?
parents were wealthy.
How about Morty Storm?
Oh, that's right.
Morty Storm.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
what this show is dedicated to more than anything, Larry. We had Billy Saluga here.
Gene Balos.
Gene
Oh
Balos.
my God, yes.
Very funny man.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah,
old
loved
friars.
Loved them all.
Mousy Lawrence is brilliant.
Mousy Lawrence was almost like he was too hip for the room in those days.
Dick
really.
Capri is another one.
Dick
Oh
Capri
my
was great.
God,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah,
Dick,
Freddie Roman.
All
Freddie
funny.
Roman
All
was
funny
very
people.
big at that time.
Dick
Yeah.
Capri is a case of an Italian who grew up, in the whole Jew thing.
Yeah.
And he knew more Yiddish and was more Jewish than I could ever be.
Yeah,
And he
yeah,
was
he
like
was.
an Italian, but he grew up in the Catskills.
There was actually one. It was interesting because the Catskills, when we were kids, was obviously a Jewish enclave, but there would be like one Italian hotel, and it
Yes.
was known that was the Italian hotel. So, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was the one Italian hotel that was up there. But yeah, there was also like Myron Cohn.
Sure.
Oh,
was,
my God, yes.
Pat
Pat
those
Cooper
guys are
was
kind of
around then.
forgotten now.
Pat Cooper.
Henny
Pat
Youngman,
Cooper was
I
great.
love.
Henny Youngman.
Pat Henry.
Henny Youngman was on Fridays actually, which was a great thrill to be able to work with him. Yeah, he was fun.
You tell me one other podcast in the world, Larry, where they're talking about Morty Gunty and Officer Joe Bolton.
It's a shame. It's a shame there isn't more.
This is the one.
And
Western civilization is built on these things.
What scares us is we'll say to people, Groucho Marx, and they'll have no fucking idea who Groucho Marx was.
So they definitely don't know who Jackie Gale was.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Morty
Jackie
Gunty.
Gale, who I had lunch with. I wrote material for Jackie Gale. I wrote material for a lot of these guys also, by the way.
Hilarious.
But you're absolutely right, Gilbert and Frank. I mean, that world is disappearing very rapidly. I often, as a kind of an informal thing, I will take a poll on the show that I'm working on, and I'll ask some of the younger people, not even that young, but I'll ask them about Jack Benny or Bob Hope or George Burns, and invariably they have no idea who they are, or they might have some vague sense of who they were. So here were these guys who were world celebrities, the biggest stars in the world, completely forgotten by this time. So it's a good perspective to keep about fame. You know, it's very fleeting, and even for someone like those guys. You know,
And you know what was interesting? There was an episode of that anthology series, Amazing Stories, that had to do with creatures from outer space gathering up forgotten celebrities.
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about.
And they bring them to outer space where they're stars.
You know what gives me hope? What gives me hope is that General Butt Naked knows who Vic Morrow is.
Also a great show, by the way.
Combat.
Fantastic show.
He's got great taste. Maybe he's a
does.
warlord, but he's got great taste.
He does. He really does.
Let this guy get out of here.
You got to tip your hat. You got to tip your hat to him.
Larry, we could do 6 hours with you easily. We didn't get to Religulous or The Dictator or hardly got into Bruno.
I'll come back. This was great fun. I really enjoyed it.
Please do.
It's great to see Gilbert again. It's great to meet you, Frank.
Pleasure.
And I thank
Pleasure's
you
mine.
both so much.
Susie Essman sends her love. By the way, I wrote to her and I said, hey, you got a question that we can throw out to Larry that'll surprise him? And she said, I don't, but tell him I love him and I miss him and he's a genius.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
That's very sweet.
this is one of those interviews that's too easy, and it spoils you for others.
Gilbert would be happy to just talk about Officer Joe Bolton and Captain Jack McCarthy. For 3 hours.
I could discuss them for hours and hours. Absolutely.
Sandy Becker.
I didn't know. I didn't even believe they weren't. I always figured he was a real cop. I mean, that really threw me. You know, when Officer Joe Bolton was not really a cop, and he would warn you about not doing the stuff that the Three Stooges did, but they were also the behind this. Like Jack McCarthy was also like the voice of the Thanksgiving Day parade, or he would be the announcer for the news, you know, the voiceover announcer. So those guys were like doing like 14 different jobs also, while they were also the on-screen hosts for the kid shows.
Well, you're a Superman guy. You must have loved that Bud Collyer, the voice of Superman, was also the host of To Tell the Truth.
And
which always
had only one
out.
leg. That fascinated me.
Freaked me out as a kid.
Freaked me out. If you got to see him walk, you go, "Oh my God, what's wrong with it?" And that stuff used to really flip me out. Actually, about Bud Collins. Bud Collins.
Oh, no, Bill Cullen had
Bill
one
Cullen.
leg. Yeah,
Bill Cullen.
Cullen. Mel Brooks does a whole bit about Bill Cullen's one leg,
where he says Bill Collins is walking over to him limping, and he thought that Bill Collins was doing a Jerry Lewis imitation. So he started walking like that.
Oh, Larry, this was great fun.
Thank
I'm going
you,
to tell
Mike.
our
Thank
listeners,
you.
find The Comedians with Josh Gad and Billy Crystal, which is great and fun. And they have to see Religulous, which my wife and I just watched. And we get you back. We'll ask you a lot of questions about that stuff.
Anything at all, man. It was great. Really fun. And yeah, we could do this anytime you want. And I'd like to do it in New York, and so I can see you guys in person.
Please,
too.
please
And
come.
Dangerous World of Comedy.
Yeah, which is wild and must be seen.
Thank you so
on
much.
Netflix, February 15th.
Did I see a woman in a fight in the background? You know what I'm talking about? When you're in the car, when you're in the limo with
Yes.
with
there's
Duke Murphy.
some fighting going
There's
on.
a
Yeah,
woman
that was in
being
Liberia. I
assaulted
think.
in the background while you're shooting this thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
I kept on trying to get my DP to shoot out the window. He kept on. We had like a little battle there, and finally he looked out the window, and sure enough, right at that moment, there was that fight going on.
You're a brave man, and it's incredible television that has to be seen. So
Thank you.
We'll
Thank
do it
you
in
so
New
much.
York next time.
Absolutely, great to see you both.
Gilly?
Thank you again.
He's going to sign off.
Thank you, Larry. So this has been Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal Podcast with my co-host Frank Santopadre and the guy who's written everything, Larry Charles. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.